Have you ever wondered how a simple cup of tea could lead to one of the most shameful wars in history? It sounds crazy, right? But that's exactly what happened between Great Britain and China in the mid-19th century. This is the story of the Opium Wars, a dark chapter that forced a proud empire to its knees and kicked off what China calls its century of humiliation. Let's rewind to the 18th century. Europe was obsessed with Chinese goods. We're talking silk, porcelain, and most of all, tea. Britain, in particular, had a massive tea habit. The problem, China was largely self-sufficient. They didn't really want anything Britain had to offer. The Chinese emperor famously told King George III, "Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance. We have no need of your country's manufactures." This created a huge trade imbalance. Britain was hemorrhaging silver to pay for all that tea, and its treasury was running dangerously low. This wasn't just a small problem. It was a national economic crisis in the making. How could Britain stop this massive outflow of silver and turn the tables on this one-sided trade? The answer they found was as cynical as it was destructive. Opium. The British East India Company, a corporate behemoth that practically ran India, started cultivating vast fields of opium poppies. They processed it into a highly addictive drug and began smuggling it into China. At first, it was a trickle, but soon it became a flood. The trade was illegal, but corrupt local officials were easily bribed, and the network of smugglers grew more sophisticated every year. For Britain, it was a goldmine. The silver that had been flowing out to pay for tea now came rushing back in to pay for opium. The trade deficit was reversed, and British merchants were making obscene profits. It was a perfect, diabolical solution to their economic problem. But for China, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The social consequences in China were catastrophic. Opium dens sprang up in cities and villages across the country. Addiction spiraled out of control, devastating communities and tearing families apart. It wasn't just the poor who were afflicted. Soldiers, scholars, merchants, and even government officials succumbed to the foreign mud, as it was called. Productivity plummeted. The social fabric began to fray, and the nation's health, both physical and moral, was in steep decline. The silver that Britain was so happy to get back was now draining out of the Chinese economy, causing its own financial crisis. The Daoguang emperor and his court were horrified. They saw their empire being poisoned from within. They knew they had to act, and they had to act decisively. The man tasked with stopping this poison was Lin Saxu, an imperial commissioner known for his integrity and efficiency. He arrived in Canton, the heart of the foreign trade, in 1839 with a clear mission: eradicate the opium trade, no matter the cost. Lin was not a man to be trifled with. He demanded that foreign merchants hand over all of their opium. When they hesitated, he blockaded their warehouses, effectively holding them hostage. For weeks, the standoff continued. Finally, the British Superintendent of Trade, Charles Elliot, buckled and ordered the surrender of over 20,000 chests of opium. That is nearly 3 million pounds of the drug. Lin Saxu wasn't just going to confiscate it. He wanted to make a statement. In a massive public spectacle, he had all of it mixed with lime and salt and flushed into the sea at Haman. It was a powerful act of defiance, a declaration that China would no longer tolerate being a dumping ground for drugs. Back in London, news of Lin's actions caused an uproar. The opium merchants, a powerful lobbying group, painted the incident as an attack on British property and an insult to the crown. They demanded war. The debate in Parliament was heated. Some, like the future Prime Minister William Gladstone, called it a war more unjust in its origin than any I have ever read of in history. But the pro-war faction, driven by greed and a sense of national pride, won the day. They argued that China needed to be taught a lesson and forced to open its markets. So, in 1840, Britain dispatched a modern, technologically superior naval fleet to China. The First Opium War had begun. The conflict was brutally one-sided. It was a clash between an industrializing naval power and a pre-industrial agrarian empire. The British Royal Navy, with its steam-powered ironclad gunboats like the HMS Nemesis, could sail up China's rivers with impunity, something the Chinese war junks couldn't counter. British soldiers were armed with percussion-capped muskets, which were far more reliable and faster to reload than the old matchlocks used by the Qing forces. The Qing dynasty's military, which had been formidable in its day, was simply outmatched and outmaneuvered. British forces seized key coastal cities, blockaded major ports, and sailed up the Yangtze River, threatening the vital Grand Canal and even the city of Nanjing. The Qing court, facing total military collapse and economic paralysis, had no choice but to sue for peace. The war ended in 1842 with the signing of the Treaty of Nanjing. This wasn't a negotiation between equals, it was a list of demands imposed on a defeated nation. The terms were humiliating. China was forced to pay a massive indemnity to Britain for the cost of the war and for the opium they had destroyed. they had to cede the island of Hong Kong to the British in perpetuity. Most significantly, they were forced to open 5 treaty ports to foreign trade, where British merchants could live under their own laws, not Chinese ones. This principle, known as extraterritoriality, was a deep blow to Chinese sovereignty, and the most bitter irony, the treaty said nothing about the opium trade. It continued, now more openly than ever. This was the first of what would be known as the unequal treaties. You might think that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. The British and other Western powers were not satisfied. They wanted even more access to China's markets and more concessions. Tensions simmered for another decade, eventually boiling over into the Second Opium War from 1856 to 1860, this time with France joining Britain. This conflict was even more devastating. The Anglo-French forces marched on Beijing itself. In an act of what can only be described as cultural vandalism, they looted and burned the old summer palace, a magnificent complex of palaces and gardens filled with priceless treasures, to the ground. The destruction was a deliberate act to humiliate the emperor and the Qing dynasty. The war ended with the Convention of Peking, which piled on even more humiliating terms. More treaty ports were opened. Foreigners were allowed to travel freely throughout China. Christians were granted the right to spread their faith. And, finally, the opium trade was officially legalized. The consequences of these 2 wars were profound and long-lasting. They shattered the image of the Qing dynasty's invincibility and exposed its military weakness, triggering decades of internal rebellion and political instability. The unequal treaties carved up China's sovereignty, creating a system where foreign powers held immense influence, and it marked the start of China's century of humiliation, a period of foreign intervention and subjugation that remains a deeply sensitive part of the nation's collective memory to this day. It's a powerful, sobering reminder of how global power dynamics, driven by economic greed, can lead to devastating human consequences. The story of the Opium Wars isn't just a piece of history. It's a crucial lesson about imperialism, unequal trade, and the dangers of addiction. It shaped the course of modern China and continues to influence its worldview and its relations with the West. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating and important as I do, please hit that like button. And consider subscribing for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next video.